Welcome everyone to our first webinar and our first Speaking for Wildlife virtual presentation entitled Enhancing Your Yard for Wildlife. So thank you for joining us. I also want to thank our friends at the Speaking for Wildlife program. They train volunteers to give these amazing presentations, and they were kind enough to let SELT use them for this series. So thank you, Haley and Emma. That's a cooperative extension. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Zoe Aldag. I'm the Outreach and Volunteer Manager at SELT. And for those that don't know SELT, because I know we've posted this in a bunch of places, so you might have come from another place. I think if Vicki, if you advance the slide there, we've got a little about SELT. We are Southeast Land Trust is a nonprofit that conserves land in southeastern New Hampshire. We protect land we focus on clean drinking water, wildlife habitat, outdoor recreation, fresh food, and local farms, and healthy forests. So this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that SELT is presenting in conjunction with the volunteers from the UNH Cooperative Extension, the Speaking for Wildlife program, as I said. And here's a list of these. So we've got tonight's, which is with Vicki, so welcome to that. Next week on Earth Day, we have New Hampshire's Wild History with Pete McVeigh, who's not here tonight. And then, as mentioned before, we've got Sue Mayotte, who is here tonight, and she will be presenting about New Hampshire bats and white snout syndrome on Wednesday the 29th at 10:30 a.m. So next week is also in the evening, but the following will be at 10:30. So a few housekeeping items, and I've kind of gone over it as we've trickled in, but we've got you all muted so that we have good audio quality, but we do want you to still participate. We know it's kind of hard to do stuff remotely, but we hope that you'll participate, and I think we've mostly found the chat function. So if you haven't found it yet, if you look at the bottom of your screen and click on the chat icon, which is a little talking bubble, and you should be able to, if you're on a smartphone, touch the screen and you can see the icons. And if you click the 3 dots, you would see the chat option there. So the other way to participate is you should all have a raise hand button. So if you raise your hand, I'll see that and know that you have a question. And there's also a Q&A box down by the chat area. There's Q&A, and so I'll have that open and I'll be looking at that, and we can mark questions as read. But so any of those ways works for us. I'll be looking at all of those while Vicki talks, and we'll answer questions kind of as we go if they make sense to do so. And we'll also have some time at the end, so we won't forget anything. And if you think I've forgotten, just feel free to chat me directly. You should be able to do that in the chat bar. So without further ado, I will introduce Vicki Brown. She's today's speaker. So Vicki is a self-described SELTie. She's also a New Hampshire Natural Resources Steward and an organizing founder of Pollinator Pathways New Hampshire. As a Speaking for Wildlife volunteer, Vicki speaks regularly on the topic of gardening for wildlife, including a well-attended program hosted by SELT in Durham on February 27th. So tonight, Vicki's going to do an abbreviated version of the Gardening for Wildlife program, just to keep it internet friendly. So I'll pass it over to you, Vicki, and I'm going to mute myself so that I'm not distracted.
Great. Thanks, Zoe. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many names I know and some that I don't. And again, thank you to SELT for providing ongoing educational opportunities to the community in a virtual way. So I'm delighted to be here representing the Natural Resources Stewards, and I am a volunteer working with UNH and New Hampshire Fish and Game to present this first in our series of Speaking for Wildlife. There are a number of different presentations for Speaking for Wildlife that various volunteers give. And as Zoe said, I've given this Garden for Wildlife presentation multiple times in the past year. I love it. I love sharing my passion for how you can attract wildlife to your yard. And as she said, this is a revision and an adaptation, if you will, of the normal presentation that I give live, which can take an hour and a half to 2 hours. And we wanted to make it more accessible for virtual. So I've re-modified it, if you will, and adapted it, changed it a little bit to get across some of the same concepts. And again, please ask questions using the Q&A or the chat function.
Uh-oh, Vicki.
So this is a ruby-throated hummingbird, and it's on a scarlet bee balm.
Sorry, Vicki, can you hear me? You cut out, your audio cut out for a moment. So if you just started at the beginning of the slide again, I think we would be on track.
Sure, at the beginning of this slide, right? Perfect, yeah. So it's a ruby-throated hummingbird, and this is my spark bird. I learned this term amongst a bunch of bird watchers. You know, usually there's one animal or one bird that gets them started being a naturalist. And the hummingbird is mine because my husband encouraged me to try to bring hummingbirds to our yard when we moved to New Hampshire 3 years ago. So I'm interested in finding out from you. You're here to attract wildlife and learn how to attract wildlife to your yard. So I'd like to ask you the question via a poll. So if you could answer the question of which animals you would like to attract to your yard. And Zoe's going to put a poll up now. And in that poll, if you could answer whether you want to attract bees or butterflies, frogs, small mammals, birds, or all of the above. So you can only select one. So if you want to do all of the above, you can click that one, or other if it's not on that list.
All right, we've got some answers coming in.
Excellent. And we'll be able to show you the results shortly.
Yep, and I know Donna just chatted saying that she can only see Vicki. Donna, can you minimize your chat screen? If you press that line in the top, you might be able to see the full screen. It might be that you've got the chat too big. So let me know if that doesn't work. All right, it looks like all votes are in. I will share that. There we go.
Wonderful. So most of you, well, half of you, more than half of you are interested in attracting all of this different type of wildlife to your yard. So that's fantastic. And I'm happy to say I will be covering all of these in some way in the presentation. So we can close that and we will move on to the next slide. So when you're looking to attract wildlife, we're really looking to create habitat that they would have in the natural world. So they're looking for food, they're looking for shelter, water, and of course they're looking for space to raise their young, or in cases of larger mammals, they just need a broader range in order to find food. So those four things really make up what we call habitat. And you know, surprisingly, many of the animals that we want to attract to our yards probably are there, and we may just not see them. In this presentation, I will talk about 7 different kinds of animals or wildlife that you might want to attract. And I will give you some specific tips about things you can do today, tomorrow, while we have time, to attract them in the ways of food or shelter or water. And in one case, I will talk about space, which normally we can't do anything about because space usually requires us buying property next door, and we don't usually have that luxury. So the first of the 7 animals I want to talk about are native bees. When we think about bees, you know, most people think of honeybees, which are not native. There are about 3,600 different native bees in the United States. And in New Hampshire alone, we know that there are more than 100 native bees. possibly as many as 350, depending on the source. But at least 100 different types of native bees. And those can be bumblebees, they can be mason bees, mining bees, leafcutter bees, all different kinds of bees. And they are all looking for some food. Some of the early ones are now out. We've seen them around. And the earliest bees, of course, they're looking for food. There's not a lot out, but they are looking for food in terms of, both spring flowers and forage. And they typically need and are looking for tall and spiky flowers, as opposed to flat flowers that butterflies tend to like. So they also see in the ultraviolet range more. So the flowers that they tend to go for are in the blue and the purple kind of range, as opposed to reds, which we don't think they see very well. On the shelter side, they need bare ground and they need cavities, depending on the bee. So about 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. They're solitary bees, typically, unlike the honeybee. So they'll make their own nest and some tunnels in that nest for their larvae. And you may see many of them together because they'll nest together, but they're not, they're in the same area, but they're not actually nesting together like a honeybee would. So those need bare ground. And others, the other 30%, need cavities. And they use these both for nesting and for overwintering habitat. So right now you can protect overwintering sites for bumblebee queens, for example, by not doing spring cleanup. Generally speaking, we recommend not doing your spring cleanup, actually not doing cleanup at all, but maybe more cut down would be a better term. But don't do it until there's at least 3 days of 50 or 60-degree weather in a row, and that includes nighttime temperatures. So many of our bees are still sleeping. They are still overwintering. And if we cut down our perennial stems where many of them are overwintering, we may lose those bees. They may not be able to emerge. So the things that you can do right now are to conserve undisturbed and unmowed areas, because there may be some nesting or overwintering bees there. You can conserve and protect cavities such as old rodent holes or cavities that you may see in trees. Under brush piles in overgrown areas as well, and even under bunch grasses. If you think about something like if you have little blue stem, which is a wonderful native grass, they may be under those bunch grasses. So my main tip for native bees right now is to postpone your spring cleanup and change it to a cut down wait until you have 3 days in a row that are at least 50, preferably 60 degrees, including nighttime temperatures. And that will enable those overwintering and sleeping bees to come out, and they can start finding a location for them to make their nest. So that's bees. Let's talk about butterflies, the second category. So there are 85 species of butterflies in New Hampshire. And if you include moths in there, because they're in the same category of Lepidoptera, moths, there are actually a lot more moths in New Hampshire. There's about 2,000 different species of moths. And we know that moths and butterflies are typically looking for nectar and pollen in flowers. And they typically are looking for flowers that have what we call landing pads. So they need something to land on. They're not hovering typically. And so flowers that have landing pads on them that are flat are really good for butterflies. And they also need to conserve energy like bees. It's good for them not to have to fly too far to get the food that they want. So it's good to plant your plants in patches. UNH recommends 4 by 4 foot patches of the same color or type of flower to try to maximize the amount of pollen and nectar that a butterfly can get, and specifically preserve their energy resources so they don't have to travel so far. So that's adults, and adults are kind of easy because we conceptually understand that flowers are what they need. What's not as well known, until recently, we didn't realize how important larval host plants were. What is that? An adult butterfly needs flowers, but a baby butterfly is a caterpillar, and they eat leaves. And typically those leaves are on some kind of plant. So in the upper right corner here, we see the butterfly, I think is a keystone species. We all know the monarch butterfly. And most of us are aware that monarch butterflies require milkweed. And in fact, the baby butterflies of the monarch caterpillar can only eat milkweed to become adults. And most of our butterflies and moths are the same. They require a specific plant to eat when they are young in that larval form. Hence this phrase, larval host plant. So you can do a tremendous amount to attract butterflies by allowing the babies to eat and not starving them by providing host plants in the form of trees and shrubs. And it's amazing that we all have these in our yards now. For the most part, if you have willows, that's one of the earliest forms of energy. Right now, willows and red maples are great sources for bees too. But trees like the oaks and the willows and the birches and the cherries, top 4 trees in terms of the number of species of butterflies and moths that they host. All those 4 trees each support more than 400 species of butterflies and moths. Oaks are about 500 species of butterflies and moths. So that's a really easy way to support butterflies. In addition to providing the adults with food, give the babies food too, in the form of those host plants. Now, one of my favorites is the clearwing moth, which is a hummingbird moth, and they eat the leaves off of the native honeysuckle, which is called the coral honeysuckle, and I love seeing those. If you like skipper butterflies, then the little blue stem grass that I mentioned is the larval host plant for skipper butterflies. And again, we all know the milkweed is a great larval host plant for the monarch butterfly. So you can look up, if you're looking for if you want a swallowtail, we know what kinds of plants they will need to eat as babies, so you can have adult butterflies in your yard. And you want those plants to be native to New England because those are the plants that these butterflies have evolved with, and therefore that's the plant they need to eat. So speaking about shelter and space for butterflies, many of these butterflies, and again, this is relatively new information coming out of the University of Delaware, and one of the eminent researchers in this field is Doug Tallamy. And what he has learned in watching his own yard and doing research for 20 years is that most of the butterflies and moths, after they finish eating in the caterpillar form, they form a cocoon or a chrysalis, and they typically attach themselves to either the host plant or a tree somewhere around. And then when the fall comes and those leaves fall down, those leaves go into the understory underneath the tree, all those caterpillars in the form of the chrysalises are underneath the tree. So it turns out that the leaves that are underneath trees have many of these caterpillars in them. So one of the tips that we have for you is to consider allowing there to be caterpillar beds. So let the caterpillars rest and allow them to emerge and become adults. By allowing the leaves to stay somewhere near that tree, you will allow more of these adult butterflies to actually emerge in the spring. And then, similar to the bees, you want to postpone your spring cleanup until we have several warm days, because again, that will allow these overwintering insects, these small creatures, to be able to come out in their adult forms. So that's butterflies. What about frogs? Some of you mentioned you're interested in frogs. I watched a really interesting webinar from a gentleman last week who basically built an entire habitat in his backyard for frogs. You don't have to do that. It's wonderful, and he was able to attract a lot of frogs, but you can do it in your yard probably without going to that level of work. So a little bit about frogs. We all know that they eat insects, a lot of insects, and that they live in the vegetation when they're not in the water. Frogs, like insects, are food for everything. Basically everything eats them. So they have to have really good shelter. So if you're thinking like a frog, where you're gonna hide? And that's the kind of thing that you wanna try to provide on your property. So They need moist things as well because their skin needs to remain moist. They're amphibians after all. So I have 3 tips for frogs. The first is reduce the size of your lawn. Doug Tallamy recommends that we each cut our lawns in half to create what he's calling the homegrown national park. I love this concept. Ask me about it if you want to know more. But you can reduce your lawn in so many ways. Easy ways, just not mowing a section. You can also mow it at a higher level. My husband and I did that. We started this 2 years ago at 3 inches, and then we went to 4 inches. And the most amazing thing happened. In the middle of the summer, we saw that we had a wood frog living in our grass. At the very bottom, under that 4 inches, there was a little microhabitat, and it was cool and moist enough for that wood frog to live there during the summer. We were amazed. And then we saw a spring peeper also in the lawn, which is actually more of a meadow-like. It's not a monoculture, to be fair, but it was at 4 inches, so it created that little habitat that was needed by the frog, by several frogs. The second thing you can do for frogs is you can plant native plants, and specifically you want to try to provide the habitat that they can hide in and shelter in. So ferns are great because obviously ferns provide cover and it's typically cooler and moist under ferns. Various types of ground covers. We can talk about things like wild strawberry and barren strawberry. Those kinds of ground covers are great. And you can plant native shrubs or herbaceous things that are low enough or high enough, different levels to provide that type of habitat. Some people talk about, for toads or frogs, even turning a pot upside down and putting a rock under it, just enough to provide some shade and moisture underneath. And I've even found frogs that, are next to our rain barrel or next to where the hose reel is because it's dripping and it's a little moist there. So you see, they'll find habitats in many different parts of your yard that you wouldn't necessarily think of. The third tip for frogs is really an important one. When you think about the amphibians and their skin, they're very, very sensitive. So really need to consider reducing or completely avoiding pesticides so that you don't harm the frogs because they will be one of the first to be affected by chemicals. So that's frogs. Let's move on to salamanders. So 2 nights ago, we had the big night. Hopefully some of you are out there looking at frogs and doing the Salamander Brigade. This is a red-banded salamander, which is very common. By biomass, they actually say there are more of these than any other kind of critter in the woods. You can find these very easily in the woods by picking up logs. If you go for a walk or a hike and pick up a bunch of logs and the rotting detritus or detritus underneath those logs, you will very often find one of these little guys. So similar to frogs, they need these moist environments. And I have 3 specific things you could do to help salamanders. So the first thing is, in your town or in your community, you probably have a vernal pool or a vernal pond. Try to protect that existing vernal pond and that vernal pool habitat because that habitat is crucial for a very important part of their life cycle. On your property, you can plant a log. And yes, I said that. What you heard is correct. I said plant a log. So what you do is you basically get a downed tree limb or a log and you put it in a part of your yard and you plant it there, maybe put some ferns or things around it, whatever to keep it moist and allow it to rot. And that will become a natural habitat for salamanders and other animals that need that kind of an environment. And the third thing that you can do, again, on your property, if you have any sort of a wild area or back area, if you have downed tree limbs or leaves, you can leave them in this wild area. And again, that creates a habitat that is appropriate for salamanders and others. They can get shelter and cover there. So Zoe, do we have any questions that we should take at this point? Just checking in with you.
No, not yet. Everyone's quiet, so.
Okay, if you have questions, please jot them down. Normally we have a lot of interaction when we're in a live program, so Zoe will interrupt me if there's a question that's pertinent to what I'm talking about coming up, so please feel free to jump in, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so the fifth category are birds, and what we have pictured here, of course, are the cedar waxwing, a male cardinal, and a pileated or pileated woodpecker. Take your pick on how you want to say that. Each of these birds exhibits a need for a habitat that's in a different part of the canopy, if you will. If you're looking for a scarlet tanager and you're a birder, you know that you look at the very, very top of a tree. They're always going to be up there. Where would you likely see a cardinal? The cardinals are typically in the 5 to 10 foot shrubby layer, right? That's usually where you see them kind of running in and out of when they're in the shrubby layer. And pileated woodpeckers are usually on dead and rotting wood, and they're eating their favorite food, the carpenter ants. So providing layers of cover and shelter and doing that in your yard will provide lots of diversity in kind of the habitat that's needed for different types of birds. Catbirds often will also be in that shrubby area.
So we do have a question. Oh,
excellent.
Yeah, we have a question from Nancy. She is asking, I was curious about the fire danger with downed trees and piles of leaves I leave in my woods. Is that a valid concern?
That's a good question, Nancy. I haven't had that question before. My initial reaction is that we do have, I think, 35 inches of rain and snow throughout the year. So unless we're in a droughty time, I wouldn't be worried about it, and we're not in a drought now. And I know a lot of different habitats require fire, as a matter of fact. For example, pine barrens. I know you don't want a fire in your yard though. So I would say that most people are not afraid of doing it in their wooded areas, of having, a few limbs or having a planted log. That's not going to provide the kind of ignitable fire source I think that you need to be worried about.
Great. We have another question too from Allison. It says, we are thinking of adding a small frog pond in the yard, but are wondering about mosquitoes. Will the frogs take care of any mosquito larvae that are in the pond?
That's a great question. Mosquitoes and ticks always come up as questions. So on the mosquito side, yes, if you have a natural habitat, you will have the natural predators of pretty much everything, including your pests like mosquitoes. Generally, mosquitoes, the larvae and the eggs, they require 2 weeks of still water before they become mosquitoes. And so even in a bird bath, I have found, because the birds are using it and because I'm changing the water every 2 or 5 days, it's not enough time for the mosquitoes. So I don't think you need to worry about mosquito larvae. You can watch it, and if you see them, you have 2 weeks to get rid of them and either change the water or net them out if you needed to. But I wouldn't worry about that as a problem. All right, so you can add food sources for these birds. You can see that the cedar waxwing here on the left is eating a berry. They make a nest every year in our elderberry bush, and that's a beautiful sight. They're late nesters like the goldfinches. So if you were to add food sources, think about adding trees or shrubs, bushes to your property that are going to add things like berries and nuts and seeds and soft-bodied insects. Soft-bodied insects primarily meaning things like caterpillars. So we were just talking about butterflies and their host plants and trees. So if you have a single chickadee nest in your yard, I discovered and learned 3 years ago that you will need, or the parents of the chickadees will need 6,000 caterpillars, up to 9,000 caterpillars in order to fledge just five baby chickadees over a period of 17 or 18 days. So 6,000 or 9,000 caterpillars sounds like a lot, but if you have a few trees in your yard, you'd be surprised how many caterpillars you might have up there, and you don't even see them, and they'll be picked off by the birds, and they're very important bird food for the babies, especially for the young. Even hummingbirds. need insects and rely on insects in both their adult form and also to feed the babies. Hummingbirds aren't eating caterpillars, they're typically eating gnats and other smaller things, but they're still eating insects. So if you were to add food sources, some recommendations I have specifically include winterberry, which is that beautiful shrub you see in the wetland areas, and it has those beautiful bright red berries, and you always say, what is that bush? Winterberry is a great food source for birds. Staghorn sumac, which grows in a lot of disturbed areas, has a very important seed head, which is used at the end of the winter by a lot of species of birds and animals. Oaks, I mentioned, for caterpillars and butterflies are important, very important source of acorns and therefore food for a number of our birds. Other trees like birches, etc. Elderberry, I mentioned, cedar waxwings and others love it. Coneflower. Coneflower is actually not native to our area, but does provide a very important source of food in the winter. And then I have a controversial one to throw out there for you, and that is poison ivy. And I know I don't like poison ivy either, but if you do have a wild part of your yard or a tree that it happens to be growing up, you may notice in the winter these tiny little grayish white berries. They almost look like bayberries. They're tiny and they're white, and you don't want to touch them. You don't want to touch the poison ivy. But the poison ivy is native, and believe it or not, it is a really important food source for birds. So I have a long list of birds that I can tell you will eat poison ivy berries. So wild turkey, both the downy and the hairy woodpecker, the northern flicker, yellow-bellied sapsucker, which I love. They make those horizontal holes in the trees to get the sap out early in the spring. The black-capped chickadee, the mockingbird, catbird, hermit thrush, the bluebird, ruby-crowned kinglet, yellow-rumped warbler, and the white-crowned sparrow. All of those birds have been documented to eat the poison ivy berries in the winter. So you say, Vicki, that's fine and well, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so I'll give you another vine. Vines are underrated. They're underrated, and they should be used more because they not just provide potential food, but they also provide great shelter and cover and habitat. So a favorite of mine is wild grape. The wild grape is a non-poisonous one for us that we can plant, and it will support food for ruffed grouse, ring-necked pheasant, wild turkey, bluebird, cardinal, mockingbird, robin, the thrushes, brown thrasher, vireos, a bunch of warblers, tanagers, the fox sparrow, the cedar waxwing, woodpeckers. And on top of the birds, the wild grape will also support other animals if you're interested in attracting raccoon, gray fox, skunk, and even bear. May not want to attract bear, but bear do eat wild grape as well. So food sources, very, very important to attract birds. If you're doing that and you have diverse layers of vegetation in your yard, you are well along the way to attracting different kinds of birds. You also want to look on your property for trees where you have natural cavities, because natural cavities are used by a lot of our birds for nesting and also for shelter to get away from the elements. So if you have a tree that has a hole in it and a natural cavity and it's safe to do so, leave it there for the birds and any other animals that might want to use that cavity. And then if you are going to be putting up any nest boxes, whether it's an owl box or a duck box or perhaps a bluebird box, I just ask you to please consider it. You're almost a parent, if you will. It's almost like you have parental responsibilities. Understand what it is that you need to do to keep the nest box clean and to keep the birds safe. In some cases, if you're not going to maintain that nest box, just like if you don't maintain a hummingbird feeder, it's actually dangerous to the bird's health and maybe more detrimental than doing nothing at all. In general, we recommend, going the natural way as much as possible. And if you are looking for some specific plants, I know I rattled off a lot of different plants, but if you want to look something up for different things in your yard for different kinds of birds, I can recommend a great resource, and that is going to the Audubon site and looking at their native plant database. It's pretty good. So just Google Audubon Native Plant Database and you'll see it in the first result. And then you'll be able to put in your zip code and maybe a few characteristics, and it'll spit out a list of native plants that you could plant for birds that you want to attract. So that's a really nice resource.
Oh, I have another question in the question and answer box. Yay. So this one's from Barbara, and it says, how do we keep neighborhood cats out of our yard?
Oh my goodness. Neighborhood cats. So cats are the biggest single cause of mortality for our songbirds. So having cats around is not a good thing. I do not have an answer for you. I don't know how to do it other than asking your neighbor who has the cat to please not let them out. We need to encourage everyone who has a cat to please let the cats be house cats and not outdoor cats. Beyond that, I don't know what to suggest.
Yeah, I'll pipe in here. I did the UNH study abroad program in New Zealand that they offer for the environmental conservation program, and here I'll turn back on video. Called EcoQuest, and one of the biggest problems in New Zealand is introduced species, because New Zealand is an island that it's a very big island, but it's still an island that evolved without any mammals. And so when settlers came and brought cats and rats and goats and everything, it was all birds had evolved to take over those ecological niches. So I'm trying to make it brief. They were doing a thing while I was there that would, they built these huge crazy fences, and I think that was the only way that they could figure out to really keep the cats out to protect the bird population, was to build these, like, they would, they would say it was they would kind of, what's the word for it? They would dedicate it as an ecologically sensitive, important area, and then make this huge fence. And yeah, so I don't know if there's a good, I would agree. I would say unless you have $1 million to make a cat-proof fence, I think the best answer is to ask your neighbors to keep the cats inside. But that's a great question. So I'll mute myself again. Thanks.
Thank you, Zoe. That was great. And yeah, obviously introduced animals are a problem in the places like the Galapagos and all the islands too. So thank you. So the person who had asked the question about cats, we watch a cat that goes in our yard by our brush pile. We can see it trying to sniff out every little, rabbit or whatever that's been there. And we know that it gets some of the birds too. And it's just a roaming cat. We don't know what to do with it either. So if anybody has an answer, please let us both know. All right, so let's go on to, I think the sixth category, next to last category, is small mammals. So we have the chipmunks, snowshoe hare, raccoons, baby raccoons, and this is a shrew. This is not a vole or a mole or a rat, but a shrew, which eats a lot of pesky things, including, slugs and such. So if you are looking to attract small mammals, you need to think about providing them with the shelter and the food that they need in all seasons of the year. So from the food perspective, thinking about summer through winter, similar to birds, you're looking for, in the summer it's easy because you have all the berries and you have buds in the spring that they can eat. But then later on, of course, starting in the fall and in the winter, they're relying on mast sources, nuts, for example, dried berries, and seeds. And it's one of the reasons we, recommend leaving perennials up, because seeds are still there, which some animals can eat and do eat. So a tip for you there is to consider, if you're adding plants to your environment, to add things like blueberries, either short, low bush or high bush blueberries, great resource for all kinds of animals. Different types of dogwoods have some, truly beautiful flowers and fruits that are beautiful for us to look at, but also very beneficial to different types of mammals. Winterberry, I mentioned before, for birds is also a good source. And, you know, things like black cherry, the prunus cherry species are also extremely good food sources for mammals. For shelter, again, thinking about which animal you're interested in attracting, or if it's a bunch of them, think about where they would go to try to get away from either the elements or from predators, including us. So some of those things could be burrows that either they have made or they're using a repurposed burrow, an abandoned burrow. Could be cavities in trees or other places. Perhaps it's an unmowed area. As we discovered when we discovered these frogs on our lawn, you know, a tiny little area can be an entire habitat for a very small animal. So I remember being at Garden in the Woods once and looking in the spring at those little May apples, which are only about 5 inches high. And there was a whole ground cover of May apples. I got down on my hands and knees and looked underneath, and you see these tiny little apples underneath this big umbrella-like leaf. And I realized that's an entire ecosystem for some little animals under there. That's where they live, and that's their shelter, you know, that's their cover. So other things you can think about are shrubs and thickets. Boulders, you know, boulders that animals can go underneath. Logs, again, we talked about logs for amphibians. Your stone wall. Your stone wall is a fantastic place for small mammals. I'm sure you've seen squirrels and chipmunks and such on your stone wall. So those are all great areas of shelter to provide for small mammals. And I wanted to do a focus in, kind of highlight, if you will, on one particular small mammal that I think doesn't get a lot of respect. And I wanted to try to share a little bit of information about the Virginia opossum, which is a maligned species and truly a bit unfairly, I think. It is a very beneficial species, the opossum. It eats a lot of the unwanted pests that you may have around your yard, just like a raptor would eat rodents. It will eat things like slugs and snails and spiders and cockroaches and rats and mice and even snakes. So the possums are really like a free pest control. And so I love them. I think they're, you know, kind of like Cabbage Patch dolls, are a little bit ugly, but they're kind of cute because they're kind of ugly, you know. But they are also a walking tick vacuum. So I said I was going to mention ticks, and ticks are always a concern if you have natural areas in your yard. We're all worried about ticks. Well, it turns out that possums are hoovers or vacuums for ticks. And the reason is this: they wander around in the woods on the forest floor, or in the woods or in your grass and passing through the meadow or whatever. And as they walk, all these ticks are attaching to them, just like the ticks attach to any warm-blooded mammal that walks by. But the possums are extremely elaborate groomers, and they spend a lot of time grooming themselves, and they love to eat ticks. So at any given time, scientists believe they may have as many as 200 ticks on their body, but they are grooming constantly as they're picking up these ticks. And a couple of studies believe, scientists who've done the studies believe that a single opossum can actually eat 5,000 ticks in a single season. 5,000 ticks in a single season. And there is also some research that shows that that number may actually be considerably higher, that it could be as many as 4,000 or 5,000 in a week. Again, if they're walking around and they're kind of these, you know, they're walking around a lot and they're getting a lot of ticks and they're doing a lot of grooming, they're eating a lot of ticks. So insects have a very high amount of protein. The density of protein is like twice what it is for other types of protein that we might eat. So they love eating the ticks. So that's good for us. If you want to encourage possum, and I encourage you to encourage possum in your yard, they do like a lot of different habitats. They basically can be suited to many different places. They don't dig themselves, but they do go into burrows that other animals have made. They like tree cavities, hollow logs, and like I said, they'll sometimes use other animals' burrows. So if you think about those kinds of habitats, if you have them in your yard, you can keep them in that wild area to try to encourage the possums, you know, definitely do so. And if one happens to fall into a well or your garbage or whatever, or you see one say hi and allow it to survive and thrive, because it will help us. So does anybody else believe in the opossum now? I hope so. And I'm going to end, the 7th category is predators. So whether you're interested in getting the avian or the terrestrial predators, the owls and hawks, or maybe the fisher and the fox and the bobcat, there are 3 things that I recommend here. First, a note. If you have done anything in your yard to attract other kinds of wildlife, if you have layers, if you have native plants, if you have less lawn, if you have lots of trees and shrubs, if you have water on your property, if you're doing those things, you are likely to be attracting the prey that these predators want. So even though they may not be living on your property, they are very likely to pass through as they are looking for food. So there are 3 things I recommend that you do besides, creating wildlife habitat for the other things you want. The first is, please avoid rat poison. So many of you know the Center for Wildlife or Jane Kelly at On the Wing, who do the raptor rehab. It's very sad, but they commonly get in owls and hawks and sometimes eagles that are dying, and they die a terrible death because they have eaten rodents that have been poisoned by rat poison. So please try to avoid rat poisons, because it works its way, unfortunately, up the food chain, and it does affect these predators. The second thing you can do is think about creating more edges. I love edges. Edges are simply where one habitat meets another. Edges are where you will see a lot of animals who are predators, surveying. Either an owl or a hawk will have a nest in a tree that's on the edge of a field, for example. How often have you seen that? Or foxes and coyotes and other predators will typically walk on edges. And the reason is their prey is hiding in the thicket and may come out to eat that nice juicy clover. And that's where they're going to find the prey, perhaps on the edge of those kinds of habitats. So create edges where you can, even if you are mowing a 4 or 6 foot wide swath through your lawn to let the other part of it grow up a little higher. Even that is a really interesting edge for some types of predators. The third thing for predators that I can recommend to you is that you create habitat for prey. So again, as I mentioned, the layers of different types of plants, providing native plants that other plants would need. If you're doing things at the bottom of the food chain for that food web, you will just naturally attract these predators in your yard. As I like to say, kind of quoting from one of my favorite books, follow nature's lead. Think about what nature would normally do in this situation. And then if you replicate that on part of your property, you'll probably be successful. So what I'd like to do is end with 5 top tips to attract wildlife to your yard. We've talked about 7 different types of wildlife and some key tips for each of those. But if you are creating habitat that looks like this, which I think is very beautiful, you've got many different layers, you've got flowers, you've got coniferous and deciduous, you've got different structure and textures. If you have any part of your property that looks something like this, you will be attracting a variety of different wildlife. So the first tip is to reduce your lawn. And I mentioned the National Homegrown Park, or the Homegrown National Park. If you cut your lawn in half, and we all did that, we would have 20 million acres that was no longer lawn. And I'd like to ask you to consider the lawn that you have. How much of it do you really use? Do you really need to mow that 1 acre or 2 acres or half an acre? If you don't recreate or use that area, for soccer, for picnics, then consider allowing that area to become something other than a monoculture. It can be as simple as allowing the violets and the dandelions to grow. We have native violets, which are very beautiful, that can naturally grow if we don't mow them. And you can also have other ground cover. You can do something as simple as not mowing part of the lawn, or you can change part of the lawn to a meadow. There's many different things that you can do to reduce your lawn. The second tip, and I've alluded to it in many different ways as we've been talking about the different wildlife, it's that diversity and that different layers of structure that you can provide in your yard, even by adding an herbaceous layer underneath a perennial or underneath a shrub, or adding a shrub underneath a tree, or putting a understory tree underneath a bigger tree. Just doing a simple addition like that will make a very big difference. And there's a lot of different varieties of different things that you can do, and it beautifies the space as well. And the thing is it also can reduce the amount of work that you have to do in maintaining your property as well. And that's a good thing. So speaking of less work and less maintenance, and also having the need for less water and less fertilizer, if you're planting native plants, you get all of those benefits, in addition to the fact that you're going to attract more wildlife. So native plants support greater diversity. Something like 17 times as many animals or wildlife forms will be in a native plant area versus an introduced area. So what is a native plant? A native plant is something that has coexisted here for hundreds of years. So at least since before the colonialists arrived, so at least for 500 years, but probably longer. When you think about our native plants like blueberries and cranberries, they are ideally suited for our environment, for our acidic soils, for our long cold winters. They have adapted strategies to live in this environment. And the animals that live with them have also adapted accordingly. So these plants will, once they are established, will not require you to keep watering them, and you will not need to fertilize them. Other than some pruning, if you have a big tree, you will not have to do a lot of maintenance, and you will have the benefit of attracting a lot of wildlife.
We have a quick question. What about rhododendron, Vicki? Are those good for this area, and do these check those boxes?
Yes, rhododendron is a very good native plant, and we actually bought one ourselves about 3 years ago and planted it. Yeah, rhododendrons are very good native plants, yes. The fourth tip is to avoid chemicals. I mentioned, that it's very bad for amphibians. I mentioned that it's very bad for some of our raptors if they're ingesting a rat poison thing. But chemicals to get rid of one insect will often basically kill all insects. So if you can, avoid herbicides and fungicides and basically everything that you can, try to avoid. And lastly, this is magic. You do not have to build a frog pond or a big pond. If you add a bird bath or a butterfly rock, which is something insects can use, it's not as deep. If you do something like that on your property, you will be amazed at the difference in what you attract to your property. We have seen so much different wildlife at all times of year because we do have a heated bird bath. And to see 8 bluebirds on a frozen, wintry February day when it's been sub-zero for 3 days in a row is truly an awesome sight. So I hope I've inspired you and given you some ideas of what you can do in your yard and on your property to attract animals and wildlife that you want to see. And we'd like to ask you another poll question. Based on what you've heard today or what you already know, I'm wondering if you could share with us what changes you will make. You can select 1 or 2 or all 5. Will you reduce your lawn? Will you add layers? Will you plant native plants? Avoid chemicals and or add water? All answers are correct.
So those are rolling in. It looks like we've got a couple people who haven't voted yet. We'll give them a couple more seconds. And all right, I will share those results.
Fantastic. So I think everybody can see this, but overwhelmingly, almost everybody said they were going to plant native, and then of those who voted. And then the second one is adding water of some sort, water source to your property. And the third is adding layers and structure. Fourth is avoiding chemicals. And the fifth is reducing the lawn. So that's excellent. Everything that you do here, anything that you do, you will see it an improvement in wildlife. So thank you for that. And I want to end, before we take questions, by just saying congratulations on, making some changes to your property to attract wildlife. You will see and observe things. I encourage you to please, create a sit spot or place that you can go and sit down and really observe and smell and hear the wildlife around you. You've created it, you've earned it, so enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicki. So does anyone have any questions for Vicki? Well, I have some questions, Vicki.
Go ahead.
So how would you know if a plant is native?
Oh, that's a great question. So as I said, native it's been here for a long time, and it's extremely difficult to figure that out on your own. If you go to the nursery store, if you go to the garden store, the nursery, sometimes they'll have a table and they'll say native, and they're not native because I looked them up and they're not. So how do I look them up? I go, my trusty source is GoBotany. GoBotany is a database that is maintained by our Native Plant Society. The Native Plant Society for New England is called the Native Plant Trust. It used to be called the New England Wildflower Society, but they are our Native Plant Society. I encourage you to go to their website, great resources for determining if a plant is native. You go to GoBotany at the Native Plant Trust. It's gobotany.nativeplanttrust.org, gobotany.nativeplanttrust.org, and then you type in either the common or the Latin name of the plant, and it will give you a helpful map of New England. And if it's green, it's native. And if it's purple, it's been introduced and it's not native. And I would recommend not planting it or not buying it. And so I take my smartphone with me when I go, and avoid buying that pretty plant that I think I want when I realize it's not native.
Yeah. So Aubrey had a question. She's wondering, what is a butterfly rock?
Ah, yeah. It's simple. You and your kids can have fun going to find a butterfly rock. So obviously insects, they can't, get water from a bird bath. So how many times you see a bee and it's like, or a fly and it's swimming in the water, like drowning. So a butterfly rock is simply a rock that has a good indentation in it that's kind of like flat, but maybe long. So it enables a butterfly or an insect to be able to go and land safely where it's not wet and put their proboscis in to get the water that they need without drowning, without having their whole body go in. So a butterfly rock would just naturally fill with water after a rain. You wouldn't even have to keep it filled up unless you wanted to. You can also create a little saucer maybe using a plant saucer and putting marbles or sticks and stuff in it, and then filling it with water so that butterflies and other insects can land on something that's not wet and be able to reach over and get the water they need. So great question. Thank you, Aubrey.
Great. So you mentioned host plants to feed caterpillars. What are the best host plants for that?
So if you want to attract a particular butterfly, the best thing to do is to look up, do a Google search and find out what is the host plant for that butterfly. Because if you have those plants or that tree there, you will get it. So if you want swallowtail butterflies, the carrot or dill or parsley family, if you have those herbs, you probably see the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar on your, on your parsley, for example. So herbs are a good thing. Also milkweed, if you want to have monarchs, and as one of our friends at New Hampshire Fish and Game non-game division said, we want to keep the common, and monarchs are, kind of common, and we don't want them to go away. So plant milkweed. And then the other thing you can do is plant trees. What's the old adage? What's the best time to plant a tree? It was 20 years ago. What's the next best time? Right now. So I love oak because oak supports 500 species. You can't go wrong with an oak. Does it take a long time to grow if you do it from an acorn like Doug Tallamy did at his property? Or if you get a little one? Yes. But you know what? In 20 years, that thing is going to be, 10 inches around. It's going to be supporting life. And if you have family in the area and you're going to be around in 20 years, it's worth it. Oak, willow, birch, maples, cherry trees, those are all fantastic host plants for the larval form of many, many hundreds of butterfly species.
Great. Well, we're just past 7:30, so if does anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Doesn't look like it. Well, I wanted to take the time to really thank everyone for coming. This was an experiment and kind of a wild idea that we had a few weeks ago. I'm thrilled that so many people came. It's really great to be able to connect with you from afar. So as we mentioned before, we do have these other webinars coming up next week. We have New Hampshire's Wild History with Pete McVeigh at 6:30 p.m. on Earth Day. And the following week, we have New Hampshire bats with and white snout syndrome. That is a tongue twister every time with Sue May, and that's at 10:30 in the morning. So we hope you'll join us for that, and you can register on our website, seltnh.org, or on Facebook, and we'll send you the Zoom link just like now. And I'll be following up with an email with the recording of this once I get it. I think it takes a little time to process, but I'll definitely send out the survey. We would love to get your feedback because this is a first-time thing. And we do have a $5 suggested donation for our outreach program. And there will be a donation link on there should you choose to make a gift. And if you think of any more questions that you have, it's hard to do on the spot. I always think of questions after I go home, so you can always email me or Vicki. And yeah, so thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay safe out there, folks.
Thank you, Zoe. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.